The pterodactyl approach can also be used against 1d4, even if white refrains from e4. In most cases, this is going to lead into some sort of Benoni-ish position. Let's take a look. After d4, g6, white will often play knight f3. This is particularly true when they are fans of the Tory attack or a Kali system or Kramnik's sort of approach to combining openings, and it allows white to continue to keep open the options of switching right back into the Sicilian. After bishop g7, we now got quite a number of ways the game can go. Of course, some people play the King's Indian attack, so we have to have a line against g3, and we do. We play our c5, and on bishop g2, we toss in queen a5 check. They're out of book now, and the position is quite respectable and reasonable and deserves a lot more study. Well, instead of the fianchetto approach, they can try a London system approach with the bishop on f4. This leads to the London pterodactyl after we play our normal c5. They support the center, we chop things off, toss the check, and here we are. Again, a perfectly reasonable position with a lot more work needed to determine the truth of the situation. Now, especially in amateur games, you've got plenty of Kali attacks, and the Kali is known to have several forms and many different move orders, but the basic ideas are that the pawn comes to e3 and the bishop comes to d3. Obviously, if they take the pawn, we can collect it by tossing in the check, so let's take a look at the standard Kali approach. We toss the check again, and now they might play c3 if they play the kind of Kali where you play c3. If they play the b3 Kalis, then they're more likely to play something like knight bd2. But in any case, black is ready to play knight f6 and castle and continue along the merry path of the opening we know and love. So let's go back and take a look at a more standard approach with c4, the main lines, people headed for typical Grunfeld or King's Indian positions. When that happens, we again play our c5 move, and now they can capture, but then we can truly mess up the pawns, toss the queen at c5, and yes, white can hang on to the material briefly, but for example, after queen to d4, black plays knight f6, all ready to castle, and the next move could well be knight c6, driving the queen away, and you can see that black has a strong initiative and white's pawns are just a mess. So capturing on c5 is nothing to worry about. When we play c5, they can also play e3. I call this the quiet queen pterodactyl. It isn't anything that's going to scare black, and queen a5 continues along the path, after which there are many different approaches for white. I've seen knight g2, I've seen bishop d2, I've seen queen b3, although that just drops the d-pawn, and there isn't quite enough compensation. The funny thing is that if you look in the databases, you won't see any of these moves because this position is quite unexplored. The only move on record that is in most databases is knight ge2 here, and that obviously is not going to scare black very much. So when white plays 1d4, we can get where we want to go quite easily. What about other moves? Well, suppose white plays knight f3. Obviously, the pterodactyl is equally playable here. Just play g6, followed up with bishop g7 and c5, and you can even use this against something like the Grob or any unorthodox opening. Basically, you play the moves g6, bishop g7, c5, and queen a5, unless white does something that really discourages one of those moves. I think if you try this approach in some games and enjoy the look of consternation on your opponent's face, you'll find that this is a very effective practical opening plan, and one where there aren't many resources to check to see what kind of good moves should be played. In the file accompanying this presentation, you will find the expert recommendations from many of the opening books and repertoire books, and you'll see recommendations for how black should play against that. In no case is there anything to worry about, and I can assure you that this opening is as good as any other, what we might call second string opening. It's going to lead to a very small advantage for white if white knows exactly what to do, but that will almost never be the case. So relax, let the pterodactyl fly, have a lot of fun, and enrich this opening so that perhaps a few years from now we will have a great body of experience to draw on. To give you an indication of the practical value of this opening, let's look at a bit of the game between Grandmaster Konstantin Sakhaev and me, played on the internet as part of the Dos Hermanas qualifying events. We're going to take a look at the approach, which is a combination of the Benoni and Roman Djindji-Hashvili's pet beefeater approach. This game was somewhat significant for the theory, but more importantly, it gives you a flavor for how interesting the game can actually become when you start out with our pterodactyl approach. The game began with the queen pawn, switched back to the king pawn, and now we have the modern defense, and back to the queen pawn end of the modern defense, and that's just the fun you can have in the first three moves with this opening. c5 is a very confrontational move here. White plays d5, and I decided to play d6 as a preliminary to giving the check, because the basic idea in the pterodactyls against this kind of center is to get in an early bishop g4 when you can against a knight at f3. But after knight c3, I was happy to fire away, and giving up the bishop for the knight does, of course, weaken the kingside fianchetto position, but on the other hand, look at those white pawns. Queen a5 puts the pressure on directly. Now, the beefeater approach from Djindji-Hashvili involves an early f5, and that could be played in this line. I choose to go elsewhere. As you can see, after bishop d2, f5 is a very natural choice, but if you do that, well, it's got all those holes and things, and playing against a grandmaster, let's play it safe instead, shall we? This is not an unknown position. There have been a number of other games played from it. White develops naturally, and black develops too. Now, black chooses, I choose a plan which is very familiar to Benoni players, which is maneuver the knight around to e5 by going to g4 first. White simply ignored my fooling around, and now I put a little more pressure on the pawn at c4. Black castle, and I pile on, kind of reminiscent of a samish variation of the Nimzo Indian. I'm just going after the weak c-pawn. Now in this position, a4 had been previously played. It isn't a particularly effective move, and Grandmaster Sakhaev introduced a new plan, a very sensible one, of playing h3. Now, because my knight's at b6, knight e5 is not a good move, so I think this was a very good idea on his part. After the knight came back to f6, white decided to blast open the center, seeing as my king is still there. But black has nothing to worry about. Simple capture, followed by knight e4, now hits different targets in the white position, and white's pieces are in no position to cause any trouble. Yes, bishop h6 keeps me from castling, but now I can support the center with f5. I'm sure that I could have instead captured the pawn on c3, and I'll be honest and tell you that I was facing a grandmaster and I just didn't want to do it. White tried to attack that very strong knight, again offering up the c-pawn, but I say nothing doing. I want to alleviate the tension, get some pieces off the board. I'm not castling kingside, obviously. White's a little bit better here, but after black castles queenside, the position is pretty well balanced, and after my knight starts to feel the pressure intensely, it retreats back to d6, once again lining up on the pawn at c4. But here, I think white could have kept a pretty decent initiative by moving the rook to b1. Here, too, I think that it was not necessary to save the bishop at e5, and that rook b1 might have put a little more pressure on my position. After the retreat, I was able to organize my own operation on the e5 square very quickly by bringing the rook over and then jumping up forward. And I evaluate this position as dead even. After the capture and the cheap sort of checkmate threat, easily deflected. And you can see that black's activity in the center, good pieces, and white's messed up pawns fully compensate for the fact that white has the bishop pair. The game eventually ended in a draw.